Welcome to the Family Life Blended Podcast. I'm Ron Deal. We help blended families and those who love them pursue the relationships that matter most. Are adoptive families blended families? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. Only if there's a step-parent, stepchild relationship within the three generations from grandparents down to the grandchildren. So yes, adoptive families are complex families, but that's not the same as being a step family. And yet there are some similarities. Are you confused yet? It's okay. We're going to help clear that up just a little bit on today's episode. We're going to be talking with a couple who have step relationships in one generation and adoptive kids in another. Stay with me. We'll get to that in just a minute. I should mention that a number of my resources, including the Smart Step Family, have information about adoption, including adopting stepchildren, do's, don'ts, things to be looking out for. If you don't have a copy of that book, The Smart Step Family, let me suggest you pick one up. And churches will love the video series that we produced based on that book. It's available for free through Right Now Media. The show notes will tell you how you can watch it for free. That's right. I said for free. Nancy wrote to me asking for guidance because she's a widow and she's dating. Again, that question seems to be coming up quite a bit. Her children are adults, and she's wondering if we had anything specifically to speak to her situation. Well, the good news is, Nancy, everything we produce has been either written in the form of the 10 or 12 books that we have available on the subject of blended families. Everything has something in it that is mindful of adult step families, as we call them when the children are adults. We've done a number of podcasts focusing on that subject matter. We have articles available at FamilyLife.com on that subject matter. So the good news is, yeah, that we have a lot, book chapters and sections. And yeah, sometimes you just have to ask. But the thing is, you don't have to look for a unique resource. You can just go to every one of our resources, and we've written it or produced it in a way that's mindful of step families with children of a variety of ages. So you will find something specifically addressing your situation. And all the stuff on parenting and step parenting really does apply to adult children as well. Now, you're dating a guy. If you guys move towards premarital counseling, I want to suggest it may be hard to find a pastor who knows how to do pre-blended family counseling, whether the children are young and at home or whether they're out of the home. That's why every few months we do a virtual training in pre-step family counseling. That's for leaders, lay leaders, coaches, pastors, anybody who's interested in working with couples and helping them get ready for blended family living. Our next virtual training is going to be in November 2023. And we also put on every year the Summit on Step Family Ministry. That happens each fall. It's going to be virtual this year. If you haven't heard yet, Thursday, October 12th, Summit on Step Family Ministry is virtual, which means you can stay at home from the convenience of your home and you can be a part of this. Our theme is Merge. We're going to help you learn to do the little things in your church in order to make a big difference for blended families. Premarital counseling is just one way the local church can help step families. We just want to help you leaders become step family aware. So here's what you do. Ask a variety of leaders from your church. I think this is the best case scenario. You can attend all by yourself, but if you get a few other people to attend with you, there's even a registration that allows you to have a bunch of people attend together. Student, children's ministry leaders, adult ed, preaching ministries, marriage ministries, you name it. Bring those leaders together and learn how you can simply merge step family principles into the ministry you're already doing. Again, the show notes will tell you all about that. Okay, let's talk adoption and intergenerational step families. Chris Brooks is pastor of Woodside Bible Church in the Detroit area. He's the author of a number of things, the books Kingdom Dreaming and Urban Apologetics, and he hosts a national radio program on the Moody Network that I have had the honor of being on a couple of times called Equipped with Chris Brooks. Now, he and his wife, Yodit, have been married for 26 years. They have adopted 3 of their 6 kids. In 2010, Yodit founded Infinite Love Orphan Care Ministry. You can tell these people are really interested in adoption and blended family living. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today.
So good to be with you, Ron.
Thank you.
Always a blessing.
Thank you for having us.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the families you guys grew up in. That'll kind of lay the groundwork for our conversation about adoption. Yodit, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about the family you grew up in.
Well, I grew up in a family. My brother and I were my mom and my dad. When we were about, I probably when I was about 11 years old or so, my mom and dad were divorced.
Mm,
And so, in that, obviously, that was a really difficult time. But my mom did later remarry. And so, my stepdad came into the picture, and that was a really interesting season. He was a huge blessing. He was a
mm,
huge blessing in so many ways, but I know what it's like to be that teenager, that preteen teenager who just wants to, push against what is trying to be established here.
mm.
And I gave him a hard time for a few years,
Is
but
that right?
then I really came to appreciate him at a certain point when I was becoming closer to
Mm,
graduating high school. And so I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for him and in our family's lives. And so he did pass away a few years after I graduated from high school, but it was a blessing to have had him, and I'm better for it.
mm. Well, that's great. I know somebody's listening right now, and they would love to know, okay, so what did he do to, withstand your resistance, if I could put it that way, when he came into your life? What tips would you give a step-parent who's kinda struggling with a kid who's, standing against them right now?
Well, honestly, he was a very patient person. He was
Mm,
very patient. And I think one of the things that he did is just continue to be consistent. He continues to be consistent with my brother and I. He did not. He really encouraged us to be able to see how those things were impacting our mom.
mm,
He
mhm,
didn't so much say treat me this way or I need to be held this way. He really was concerned about how those things were impacting her. And I think that was a blessing, because it helped us to come outside of ourselves. And of course we loved our mom, and we also knew that, the other scenario was never going to happen, again, as it relates to our dad. So, after time, you just saw his continued perseverance with us, his
mhm,
patience with us,
mhm,
and then also his faithfulness to my mom. His
mm,
faithfulness to my mom and to our family, and the sacrifices that he would make. And so that really softened us towards him
mm.
as time went on.
As time went on. I think that's one of the key things that we talk about a lot on this program, and
Mhm.
you just, reflected one of the principles we tell step parents: "Have patience, stay in the game, don't
Right.
quit, be stubbornly patient," maybe is a way to say that. I'm curious,
That's a good way.
was your biological father in your life after your mom and dad divorced?
Yes, he was. He was, and I mean, he was in my life, and we were kind of actually more adversarial just because of some of the circumstances. But he was there, and I'm grateful because my mother, despite the challenges of why they were divorced, there was a lot of abuse and things that were involved. She was very adamant about encouraging us
Mm,
to always consider our father, to call our father, to reach out to our father. And she was intentional about not speaking ill of our father, to
mm,
us, even though we knew, so many different things. And so that also laid a good foundation for us to eventually reconcile our hearts with our father,
mm,
um,
hmm.
some years down the road. And that made a huge difference in many ways, including spiritual, and us being able to really understand our relationship with God, and let Him in ways we had closed off because of our relationship with our biological father.
You just made, I think, a very interesting, connection I wanna make sure our audience heard, and that is that the way your mother talked about your dad, encouraged your relationship with your father, made a difference eventually in you being able to forgive him?
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely, absolutely, because there wasn't, all these additional years of vitriol and,
Mhm.
frustration and things that were being compounded, after the divorce, at least at my mother's hand.
Mhm.
So she was able to really, in some ways, be a person of peace when it came to
Mhm.
that opportunity to reconcile with him. Even though she herself had been hurt, obviously, she made a very mature choice for us to not put that upon us. So it was
Mm.
huge.
Yeah, it is. That's great. Chris, I believe your parents divorced when you were young and you eventually had two step parents. I'm curious, some similarities or differences from your wife's experience there?
Yeah, I think my parents just both loved the Lord. Father was a kind of itinerant preacher, just had a hard time navigating the ins and outs of relationships with one another. I will just say, from a young boy's perspective, the father figure is so important. And
Mm.
so, one of my earliest childhood memories, unfortunately, was the night my dad left. I still remember me and my brother, who's about 3.5 years older than I am, standing in the driveway saying, "Dad, don't go," as he,
Mm.
after a big argument between my parents, was pulling out a driveway saying, "Sorry, I gotta go,"
Wow.
and so that definitely marked me and my brother, albeit in different ways. I think with me, there was the insecurities that came from family instability. With my brother, I think there was a more hardening of heart that came with
Mm.
his departure. But much like Yodi's story, my stepdad stepped in, and we were hard. We were jerks. We were not happy that he was there originally, and gave him a really hard time. But he was the type to let us know, although you're kicking and screaming now, you're really going to look up one day and be super grateful that you had a father present, that you had a dad present. And he never tried to compete uh,
Mm.
with my biological father. As a matter of fact, much like Yodi, my mom never poisoned my perspective of my dad. I found out much later in life that she certainly could have,
Mhm.
but she didn't. And my stepdad encouraged my relationship with my dad in some pretty extraordinary ways. Now being a father myself, he was tremendously gracious with my dad and gave him space to be able to still be in my life in a non-competitive way. And certainly that helped with the healing process. And again, much like my wife, there was a long period where my father and I, were estranged from one another, just out of inconsistencies in his parenting.
Mm.
But later on, towards the end of his life, we were able to reconcile, and had the last 3 years of his life, we were able to have restored relationship and super close. But it was something, I think, for guys, the relationship with your biological father in particular is kind of the final frontier. You need to be able to have some healing, some reconciliation within that relationship, and there's ways to do it even when the father is not present, but you need to be able to get some sense of closure, or it's going to plague and impact every other relationship you have, including your relationship with God.
Mm.
But my stepdad was great, and all the things that he prophetically said in those moments where we were kicking and screaming were right. We look up now, and we're so grateful for him instilling within us character, discipline, work ethic, compassion. The way he served my mom is, in many ways, it became a model for me and my brother in the way that we serve our wives
Mm.
and our kids. And so we were blessed.
We have said so many times on this podcast that redemptive that step families done
Mhm.
well are
Yes.
redemptive in the
Yeah.
in the
Mhm.
life of the next generation, and you guys have both just demonstrated that, talking about your step parents and the role that they have played in your life, and how a step parent who comes in and patiently with a non-compete clause, like you guys both,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
says not competing with the other biological parents in this scenario, or anybody else in the other home, that just creates this opportunity for emotional safety and trust, and
Right.
Yes.
eventually it sounds like, at least for the two of you, that helped soften your hard hearts.
Yeah, certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say for sure. I mean, if they would have taken, I mean, just think about, we were young. We were both pretty young. So the vulnerability that is there, if they would have taken a hardened approach,
Mhm.
if they would have taken more of a combative or competitive approach, we certainly could have been swayed. And the
Yes.
difficulties that come along with being with co-parenting
Yes.
would have been more complicated, more exacerbated, and more difficult. And so there's a lot of grace, a lot of patience, a lot of wisdom that's needed if it's going to be redemptive. So I know that it's easier to talk about than it is to live out.
Yes.
But
Like
I
most
would
things.
100% agree with you that if we were blessed to have those step parents that were in it for the long term.
Mhm.
Mm, mm. Chris, I think I heard you refer to your stepdad once as Jethro. You wanna tell
Yeah,
people what's behind
yeah,
what's
I
behind that?
do. I do. You got a good memory. Well, if you know the story of Jethro and Moses, Jethro marries this Midian wife, and he is, man, trying to lead, and he is in leadership over his head in a lot of
Mm,
ways,
mm.
and he needs wisdom beyond his years. And it's Jethro, his father-in-law, who comes, and we don't know much about the religious background of the Midianites. We know they're not Israelites. We know they're not worshipers of Yahweh, Jehovah. But clearly, there was some wisdom there and some moral law that was at work in his heart. And my dad's spiritual journey is a complicated one, and he went through, though he would firmly profess faith in God, firmly profess faith in Christ. He was estranged from the church. And so I wouldn't put him in a typical category of your normal churchgoer, but yet there was a lot of wisdom there
Mm.
and the moral law of God ingrained. And I jokingly say I have a proverbial dad. So there's a proverb about everything. There's a story about everything. Sometimes we wish we would have got put on punishment instead of the lecture, but you grow up with these stories ingrained in your heart. And for me, being called to leadership at a young age, I was pastoring in my 20s and married at a young age. In many ways, his wisdom, much like Jethro to Moses, I look back and I say, man, I'm not sure if I would have survived in leadership or
Mm,
in marriage if it
mhm.
wasn't for his wisdom.
Mm, man, what a blessing, what a gift. That is a grace from God right there. And to any step parent listening to me right now, and you think, is it worth all of the time and energy and the late nights and the sweat and the blood, sweat,
Yeah,
and tears and not getting sleep and wrestling over your relationship with your stepchild? Is it worth it? Well, I think maybe
yeah.
you can hear it is. Hey, guys, I'm curious. So, coming out of the families that you grew up in, complex family environments, you had, you know, good relationship with at least one step parent at some point in your life. I'm just curious though, when it came time for the two of you to fall in love and get married, I'm wondering what the blessings were that you carried forward as you thought about family and you thought about what it would be
Mm.
like to create your own family and do marriage. And at the same time, I'm wondering what the vulnerabilities were that you maybe had to work through or try to overcome.
Mm.
Yeah, I'll say one thing about your family that has been a blessing is that Yodit's mom was really, really strong in instilling between her and her brother a deep sense of commitment to each other. that family was a priority, and that you care for family, you provide for family, and that was deeply instilled in you guys. And I think you carried that into our relationship, and certainly even now with our kids.
Yes, for sure. And your parents, and we could speak to our own, but same thing with your parents. There were some things that your family experienced some years before I came in to the picture, and just amazing, amazing commitment to one another is what they just demonstrated, and that to me was just admirable
Yeah.
in what I wanted. I knew in our marriage. And so the great thing is that our parents were very supportive of us
Yes.
when we were dating, and when we were engaged, when we came to that place of being engaged. They were extremely supportive of us. And so in fact, I think your mom just kind of called it out and said, "That's your wife. She's going to be
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
wife, right?"
Your mom came around.
My mom came around.
I
But your
had
mom,
to work hard to get her on board.
your mom was a prophet, right? Prophetess.
My
She,
mom fell in love with Yodi from the first time she met her.
that's
Yeah,
really
she
And
great.
she
yeah, she
she
was
loved you from the beginning.
yeah.
I think her mom had to warm up, but yeah, we did come from. Even though there's some similarities in our family structure, Ron, the dynamics of our family were different. I would describe it this way: that Yodi's mom, for a number of different reasons, had to be very strong and had to
Yes.
demonstrate leadership in a way that was like a single mom,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
My dad was still the kind of dominant. And my mom is very strong, very strong, but my dad is still very much kind of head of household.
Mm.
And so coming into marriage, I kind of came from a household where there was a dominant father figure. You know, she came from a household that I would describe as being more of the dominant mother figure. So I think
Mhm.
we had to learn how to work that out.
Sure, there
Yeah.
was a little bit of that. My mom was it was a little bit more matriarchal, just kind of in the way that things, shaped up in our family. But one of the things that was very present for both Chris and I
Yeah.
was the commitment to be married
Mm.
and to
Yes.
make
Yes.
sure
Yes.
that we built a marriage that would last. And so for both of us, our moms were not our father's first wives, and they weren't their last. And
Mm.
so our dads had been married a number of times, and so that fact for us was something that we just found, wasn't we didn't want that to be the goal. I mean,
Yeah.
we wanted to start off with a mindset that we would do as much as we can to invest into our marriage so that our marriage could be sustained,
Yeah.
and so that's been a commitment that we continually have had to renew. It definitely affected how seriously we took our premarital counseling,
Mm.
because it was still very fresh to us in some ways. And we recognized, because we had a great premarital counselor, we began to recognize a lot of the things that we were carrying that would have been barriers to us
Mm.
being able to have a
Good.
good foundation in our marriage. And so
Yeah.
we were so that's the thing. We had a goal in mind of what
Yeah.
we wanted our marriage to look like, even though we didn't fully see that with our biological parents.
Right.
But our mothers and our stepdads actually helped to give us a better picture of what that could look like for us.
Yeah, and you came in committed to stability. You didn't wanna,
Absolutely.
repeat that
Yeah.
instability from the past. Yeah, that's great, and
Right.
I think that motivation is strong in a lot of kids who grow up in complex family environments. They wanna take the best, and they wanna do something a little bit different from the things that didn't work for them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Something else that I'm wondering about that seems to have worked for you, you guys, tell us about your kids. You've you adopted three, and then have had three biological children since adopting those three. I'm wondering, have you ever thought about this? That the way your stepfathers came into your life and adopted you, not necessarily legally or formally, but they did so relationally, emotionally. That
Mhm.
did that plant a seed in your heart for wanting to
Yeah,
adopt
I know
somebody
for
else?
yeah, I know for me, I don't know if I would have articulated it that way that it planted a seed for me wanting to adopt. I think most of that came from Yodi's heart and her sharing that vision with me. But I will say, being able to love a child that was not yours biologically
Mm,
was modeled for me so well that did not seem foreign,
hmm,
that didn't
hmm,
seem
Mhm.
difficult, because the way that um, my stepdad, who I just referred to as my dad, the way that he loved me, uh, loved my brother, his commitment to us, um, honestly, Ron, was no different than what I could feel from my biological parents. And
hmm,
so,
hmm,
from that perspective, certainly it helped.
hmm,
Yes. And I think that it really, honestly, that's a good point that you make, because that probably led into us experiencing our first adoption probably before we
Yeah,
would have,
yeah,
because that's very similar to how that our story of adopting our oldest, our first child, our son Christopher, kind of happened,
yeah,
because he was just a young man that we knew from our church, and he was a teenager. And so, just because of some life circumstances, found himself in a place where he didn't have a place to go.
hmm,
He didn't
hmm,
have a place to live. And we just it kind of happened very organically at first
yeah. We
and
took
took
him
him in.
in.
And, Chris really walked right into that same heart and mind as he's mentioning about his stepdad, that sense that he needs to have a strong father figure in his life. And in the absence of that, I will stand in that gap for
hmm.
him. And
Wow.
that's really how it got started.
Hmm.
That's
Man,
how our family started.
what a beautiful picture. And since then, you adopted two more and then have had three more.
Yeah.
Tell us briefly about your kids.
Yeah, so so Christopher was a teenager
Mhm.
when he came into our family, and then we subsequently, a few years later, adopted our daughter Zoe from Ethiopia, which
Hmm,
is where my family is from. And so, in having a heart for adoption, I always envisioned going to Ethiopia to adopt, and so we adopted her as an infant.
hmm,
And a few years after that, we adopted our son Cameron through the foster care system here. And so he was a little guy as well. And so we've experienced adoption on so many different
Yeah.
forms, kind of a, relational guardianship kind of a teenager
yeah.
situation,
Open
and
adoption,
international adoption, a
foster
domestic
care.
foster adoption
Mhm.
that was a partially open adoption.
And then you went the
And so,
traditional route and had three biological.
Yeah,
yes, yes, as the Lord would have it, we
yeah.
did.
Which I hear is pretty typical, pretty common.
It's not so uncommon, right?
Mm,
But yes, and so we have three additional kids who came after that, and we have Judah, Judah, who is now 9 years old,
Yeah,
Sophia 7, and Christiana, who is 3.
mm.
Um, our oldest daughter, Zoe, we adopted from Ethiopia, is 16, and Cameron is now almost 13 in a few weeks.
Wow.
yeah. And as we've talked about before, Ron, our oldest, our first adoption, Chris, passed away in 2019, and
Mm,
so we have 5 kids at home and 1 kid in heaven.
mm.
Hmm.
And my heart goes out to you about
Yes.
that. That of course is our story as well. Lost our middle son out of our
Mm,
three, and it is
yeah,
a life-changing experience that never stops changing.
that's
And it's
right.
one of
Yes.
those things that continually draws us back to the heart of God so that we can just get through it because it's
Yes.
such a difficult thing. Well, thank you for telling us about your kids. I'm wondering what you've learned about adoption over the years that you wish somebody would have told you on the front end.
It- it-
Well, for me, one of the things that's interesting is I had someone to tell me some things and I ignored her completely because I only wanted the romantic stories
yeah,
about
yeah.
adoption, about
Yeah,
everything
right.
just being, roses and rainbows. And a good friend, actually, she came to be a great friend. She was very sober about it. She
Mhm.
said, "I'm going to be the one to tell you that this isn't always going to be easy, and that there will be challenges, and that there will be obstacles that you'll face because of the fact of adoption. That kids who were adopted often, just have see things in a different way because of the fact of their adoption."
Hmm.
And she kind of gave me some of those things, and like I said, I wasn't trying to hear it at the time, but I
Mhm.
did hear her. And so as we have faced obstacles, those words have come back, more so to honestly bring comfort, because it wasn't that we were strange going through problems. That every family goes through challenges, and
Exactly. Right.
we could expect it.
Yeah, I think for me, Ron, just a few things. One is that every problem is not an adoption problem.
Yes.
So when you can, in the back of your mind, think every time your child runs into a challenge or has a bad response or is rejecting of your love, that,
Mhm.
oh, this is because of adoption.
Hmm.
And the blessing of having adopted kids and biological kids is that you realize parenting is parenting. Teen
Yes.
years are teen years,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, with that being said, I think the second thing that I've been reminded of over and over again is that no matter how well you love them, there's still a big part of their story that they're going to want to know. All of us find some sense of um, strange stability, identity in knowing our origin story.
Mhm.
And so for our kids at different points in their journey, knowing their origin story, knowing, details, biographical details about their life has been important. And so, bits of advice that I would give to adoptive families are try to get as much details as you can about those stories so that at the appropriate time, and it's different for each child, you're able to help them along that journey.
Hmm.
And don't feel that it's any act of betrayal that they want to know
That's
about
right.
their family of origin. And then the third thing and final thing I'll say is that for adoption to happen, something traumatic had to happen. Adoption doesn't happen unless something traumatic did happen. That could be the death of a parent. That could be a parent who went through addiction. That could be because of abuse, a whole assortment of things. And so just know that that child has already been through trauma, even if they were too young to know it then. And
Mhm.
at some point in their journey, they're going to have to process through that. And again, it's really important, as hard as it may be, not to take that personally,
Hmm.
that they have to process through that and to be as supportive as you can.
For years, I've had adoptive parents come to my step family seminars and say, all that stuff you say about step parenting, that's very much what it's like when you adopt a child. And I just heard you hit three big ones. The identity question, who am I,
Yes.
wanting to know about my family that's elsewhere. And, for kids in blended families, there's often family elsewhere, even if it's a deceased parent. What would it
Yes.
Yes.
have been like for me to have lived with that parent? And
Right.
how can I imagine my life now if they were still here? Or for children back and forth between homes, it's the family that's out there somewhere that I get to be with, but I don't get to be with that much because I'm split
Hmm.
between different households and different grandparents. And it always seems like somebody's missing. That's that common narrative. And then the big one is grief and loss. And For our
Yes.
listener, I want to point out an obvious parallel here in adoption and step parenting. And it's when you are in a state of bliss or happiness or joy about the relationship, kids can also join you in that sense of this is a really good thing that's happening, us being together. And at the same time, there's a part of them that's sort of split off and they're sad.
Yes.
Yes.
And they're
Yes.
grieving what isn't, they're grieving what could have been, they're grieving what they don't know and don't understand,
Right.
and that sadness can look like, feel like, sound like rejection sometimes.
Yeah.
And is
Yeah.
have you guys
You
experienced that before?
100%. And
Yeah.
one thing I would add to that, Ron, is to say this is again where I think our childhood helped us, or at least
Mhm.
I will say personally helped me, is that while I absolutely love, respect, and appreciate my stepdad for a long, long time, I live with the dream in my heart and mind that one day my mom and biological dad would get remarried and live happily ever after. And I don't know,
Mhm.
I didn't do the math in my head. I don't know how that was going to work out. But it just is a reminder to me and an affirmation of what you just said, that God has created us in such a way where we can feel dual emotions at the same time.
That's right.
I was happy for my stepdad's presence in my life, while at the same time longing or grieving for my biological dad's presence in my life. So now, fast forward to being a dad, a parent, I kind of fully expect and anticipate that for my adopted kids, that's going to be a reality as well. And I don't take that as a deficiency in my parenting. I don't
Mm.
take that as an assault against me. It's just the reality that they're going
Mhm.
to have the dual emotion of, man, I love and appreciate you and what you are to me, but I also, in my mind, long for and really fantasize about what could have been.
Mhm.
Another aspect of that I think that I we actually used to talk about this, and this is a common terminology, is that sense of nature versus nurture. And we would talk in those terms at the beginning when we were contemplating adoption and when we were going through adoption processes about how nurture was going to trump nature no matter what, and we were going to just
Love them.
we're going to love them through it, and we have to love them through it. But the reality is that there is a lot of nature. I mean, we are flesh and blood. We
Yes.
are flesh and blood that is made and built off of DNA and a lot of other things that are harder for us to understand. And so some of those things do come into play, and that's an adoption situation. That's a step parenting situation as well. And we realized that it was a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a matter of us fixing our will to, bend them, into a certain direction, but it was that there is a lot of interplay into understanding who they are. Not just who I want them to be, but
Mm.
who are they, and how has God shaped them? And now, how do I make changes in my own parenting style to accommodate who God is creating them to be?
Oh, that's so good. I've often said that we all have one dad and one mom, and that occupies a huge space in someone's heart. Now, there are other
Yes.
people who come into our life who also slide into our heart, coaches, mentors, uncles, and aunts, and people who have a significant role perhaps in a season of our life that make a
Mhm.
big difference in who we are. We carry stuff from them. We cherish that relationship and what they bring to our lives. But if loving that person means moving out the big mom or the
Mm.
big dad spot in the heart, then I have a
Mm.
conflict. Then I don't know what to do with. And I've often said sometimes kids like and love their step parent, and that's the problem. They like and love you. They don't know where to put you because that bumps up against that dad part of their heart or mom part of their heart, especially if mom or dad is MIA.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because the thing it's hard to love what I have when what I really, really long for is not here. And
Mhm.
Mhm.
and so that's such a conflict for children to find those
Mhm.
to navigate those spaces in their heart. And yes, you can't take it personally. Otherwise, you get so wrapped up in your head and navel gazing,
Yeah.
sometimes we say,
Yeah.
Yes.
feeling sorry for yourself that you're no longer in a posture to be able to support and help the child on the journey that they're on.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and it's so important for us to look at it, Ron, through their perspective. So much I think of parenting as us inviting them into our world.
Mm.
We have to counterbalance that by stepping into their world as often as we can.
Mhm.
And sometimes with my son, Cameron, who's adopted, there's nothing like firing up the old Xbox
Mhm.
and pulling out some remote controls, playing a game, and just asking him questions about how he's doing, about life, and trying to see life through his world.
Mhm.
But also, one of the things we've learned too is what adoption means for the biological kids
Right.
as well, because my wife was sharing even about this interview today, and she was sharing with our kids that this isn't just about us. This isn't just about your adopted siblings. Adoption affects all of us. It affects every one of us.
Mm.
And so it's important to be able to connect some dots in those moments where they seem a little bit curious or confused with how does our story work again? And
Mhm.
we have to help them to connect dots to say, this is how God has uniquely written our family's love story, and we wouldn't have it any other way.
I was gonna ask you guys about your biological children and just, what observations would you make about them getting along, bonding with adopted siblings? The fact that your biological kids came after the adopted children would lead me to believe that they sort of big brother, big sister, like, this is
Yes.
just
Right.
our family and the way it is, but at the same time, they become aware at some point that there's a different origin story.
Yes. Yes. And so that's how things have happened, for us and our kids. And I think just in my, flat thinking about adoption, in even prior to us being married, my thought was more towards adopting. And if we had biological kids, then that would be great. And I would love to have the adopted ones first because then that's kind of the great equalizer.
Mhm.
Well, you guys were adopted and we're biological, but yeah, we were here first. You came later. That would be the equalizer of it all. But there definitely comes those times, and kids are kids, and they
Yeah.
process, in their own ways. And so for many years, honestly, as our younger children were too young to really understand it all, it was just big sisters, big brothers, and to I would say to the greatest extent, it still is that way. But
Yeah.
there are those moments of childhood immaturity and
Mm.
lashing out where they have mentioned that one to the other, about these facts. But I think again, it's more about kids.
Mhm.
Kids, being kids than it is about their hearts towards one another.
Mhm.
Honestly, they don't know how to have a different heart towards each other because
Mhm.
that's all they know. And for our kids who were adopted, they were very much a part of the process when our biological kids were coming
That's right.
into the
Mm.
family. So our interesting story about our first biological child actually
Judah.
came, Judah. Zoe was about she was about maybe 6 years old or so, 5 or 6 years old. And Cameron, who was our was also adopted, he was about 2 and he was becoming more independent. And
Mm.
I started thinking about adopting again. And I was thinking, okay, well, he's moving out of the way, as they say, and maybe it's time to think about, the next adoption. And so Zoe comes to me and says, Mom, I think we need to have another baby. And I
Mhm.
said, I was thinking the same thing. And she said, yeah, I think we should have another baby. And I said, I was thinking that too, but I was trying to think about whether we should adopt from Ethiopia or if we should, adopt through foster care again. And she looks at me with this little mischievous 6-year-old eye and says, "Nah, I think this one needs to come from your belly." And I said, that would be interesting because at this point, Chris and I had been married for about 10 years, I think. 10 or 11 years, and I had actually even had a surgery that
Mm. Hmm.
would say, my doctor would say that, I wouldn't be able to have children biologically without in vitro fertilization. So it was kind of one of those moments that I looked at her and I said, well, let's see what God does. Let's pray
A
about it.
child's faith.
And it
Yes.
is an amazing part of our story.
Yes.
But within a year or so, little Judah showed up on the monitor,
Wow.
and that began our biological journey. So our adopted kids really have a sense of connection to the origin, even of
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
biological aspect of things, which is very unique, obviously.
Yeah.
But we're grateful for that. And so and as much as possible, we don't talk at home in terms of adoption and biological. We don't really make
Mhm.
that distinction, honestly, unless it is something that is, just biographical information about our family.
But
And
I
so
would I
they,
will I would say this though, that our kids were blessed to be able to grow up around other blended families,
Hmm.
yes,
and other
other
adopted
adoptive
families.
Okay.
families,
And
yes,
so for them, a lot of it was natural. So they
Gotcha.
were able to see that through our local church. So as
yes,
much as possible, if churches can cultivate both blended family ministries and adoption ministries, it
yes,
really does help
Mm.
and
Chris,
help the kids.
I can totally see what you're saying, and that is absolutely right. If you're the only one, who doesn't
Yes.
look like everybody else, then it just
Yes.
adds to that sense of differentness, and with
right,
that,
Yep.
perhaps some unnecessary shame, and we don't need that. But when you're
No.
around others who look, feel, taste like you, then all
Yep.
of a sudden,
hmm
that's just sort of normative. And as you're talking, there's direct parallels again in this conversation between step siblings. Maybe a
For
biological
sure.
child comes along after a
Yeah.
blended family has formed, and so you have these different nature of how we all got here stories, and yet
Mhm.
love pervades, and as the expectations to treat one another with dignity and respect and honor, and you don't treat your brother that way, you don't treat your sister that way, I don't care where they came
Yes.
from. Those sorts of
Yes. Yeah.
right,
parental
Yeah.
expectations create climate where, hey, this is family and
Yes.
we love each other.
Yes. Yeah, and I
yes,
would also say, Ron, that the other thing we had to learn, and we still have to navigate, is that the biological kids can get a little bit jealous when you got two birthdays. Seemingly, you got your
Uh-huh.
birthday and you got your
you're,
gotcha day and
Uh-huh.
yes,
other celebrations. It's like, man, they're getting some perks here, you
Yeah,
know.
we
we
have
have
had
definitely
that.
heard that before from biological kids who have step siblings who have 2 or 3 birthdays, and the bio kids only
Yeah.
get 1.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
So we've had to learn, how do we make those adoption days special
Yeah.
without them feeling as if, hey, it's just all about gifts and stuff. How do we make them
Mm,
meaningful? And then,
mm,
like you said, I think the last thing I'll say on this is it's really important for us to instill in our kids, even in moments of anger and frustration, what's off limits
mm,
and
mm.
things you can't say
hmm
even when you're upset and
Right,
mad, because like any other child, when you're hurting, you might say hurtful things to retaliate. And we have tried to, as parents, say, we know you guys are going to have disagreements, but we never ever should cross this line
Mm.
of being
In other
of
words,
saying certain things.
something like, "You're not my real brother," or "You're" something like
Right.
that?
Right, right, right. Just like you wouldn't want two biological kids to say to one another, I wish you were never born.
Oh,
I
yeah.
wish mom and
Yeah.
dad would have never had you. You don't want a biological kid saying to an adoptive kid, I wish you were never adopted.
Mhm.
You have to kind of set the expectation and the bar that that's unacceptable
That is so
conversation.
good. That is a
Yeah.
great, great boundary. I think there's a lot of
Yes.
wisdom in that. By the way, I could totally see an adoptive child saying to a bio kid where you were an accident and I was chosen. I mean, it
Absolutely,
can cut
absolutely, it can
both
go both
ways.
ways. But those statements will stay with kids, and I
Yeah.
They
still
do.
remember things teasing or
Mm,
things that were said from my childhood, and you can't take those things back.
yeah.
And so we want to cultivate within our family as much as possible loving and affirming language. One of the things that helped too, Ron, is that my wife, you mentioned in her bio that she started an adoption ministry, orphan care ministry, rather, within our church in 2010. I think that's helped our kids as well,
Mm,
being very much able to openly talk about this, being very much able to serve other adopted families, being very much able to celebrate the joys of the adoption of other kids. I think all of that has been a huge help, and I'm
that's great.
grateful that
That's
my
great.
wife
Mm,
has been able to do that.
love it. Love it. Hey guys, let me ask you one last question. Let's go vertical.
Yes.
What does adoption teach all of us about God and our relationship with Him?
Well, it teaches us, first of all, it obviously teaches us about how we were adopted into the family of God. And it helps to make that so much clearer. It really is a life parable, but also really what it means to lay your life down for a friend.
Yes. Yeah.
Because there's so much that Christ has done on our behalf that is hard for us to fully understand until those moments where you find yourself in a similar situation, of
Mhm.
laying your life down, laying your emotions down, laying your pride down, as he's talked about, putting your emotions aside so that you can allow that child to, have their moment. Just so much of that happens in the process of adoption and raising children. That is, and then the heart of the father for us, his heart is always for us,
Mm,
even when we're acting out, even when we are feeling or acting unlovable, his heart is always for us.
mm,
And that's something that often
Yeah.
just sticks out to me.
Yeah, I think for me, I'll sum it up this way, Ron. It doesn't matter how you got into the family. Now that you're here in the family, you are family. And when
mhm,
we look at the local
mm.
church, we all have, as the saying goes, every saint has a past, every sinner has a future. And every one of us got to the foot of the cross differently. But praise God, we're part of the family. And if you're a part of the family, you're in the family, and that's all that matters.
Mm. Man, that is so good. Thank you guys for being with me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.
Well, if you, the listener, want to know more about their work, their ministry, you can check the show notes to learn more about them. If you want to leave us a question about a future episode, you can do that as well. And I am just chewing on that last statement there. If you're a part of the family, it doesn't matter how you got to be a part of the family, you are part of the family. Wow. Well, we'd love to have you in the Family Life Blended family. If you haven't subscribed to this podcast yet, please do that. We don't want you to miss anything that's coming up. And if you don't know, we're on YouTube and we're on other places, and you can find us all kinds online as well. So subscribe. We'd love to have you follow along and not miss anything that's coming. Hey, if this podcast or our ministry is serving your family, let me ask you to consider doing one of two things. Share a resource with a friend so they can benefit like you have, or donate to Family Life Blended so we can reach out to someone else. Doesn't have to be much. It'll just help keep the lights on, and we will appreciate it. Again, the show notes will let you know how you can do either of those two things. I mentioned earlier that our next Summit on Step Family Ministry will be virtual this year, Thursday, October 12th. Go to summitonstepfamilies.com for more information. I also want you to know that our Preparing to Blend virtual training, it's 2 hours. It's on pre-step family counseling. The next is going to take place on November 7th or November 9th. You get the choice of 2 days with 2 different times during the day, whichever whichever one of those works better for you. And my virtual 12-hour continuing education training for therapists or coaches on step-family therapy is going to be on November 16th and 17th. Again, lots of virtual training opportunities coming up. Get connected to all of these in the show notes. Well, next time, I'm talking with well-known author Dr. Rosaria Butterfield about how Christian parents and children can respond to the LGBTQ plus phenomenon in our day, to individuals, to friends, to family members, and how we respond with love and truth. That's next time on Family Life Blended. I'm Ron Deal. Thanks for listening. Thank you to our production team and donors for making this podcast possible. Family Life Blended is part of the Family Life Podcast Network, helping you pursue the relationships that matter most.